Hello, Jason,
Hi, Kenan.
and thank you for accepting our invitation to contribute a podcast recording to our reality project. We're really happy to host you because we know you have a lot of experiences in conducting teacher research projects and doing research on teacher research project and even theorizing it in different ways. So, after my brief introduction of you, would you like to introduce yourself a bit to our audience?
Sure. I'm Jason Anderson. I like to introduce myself first and foremost as a teacher. I don't always do so, but that's the most important part of who I am and what I do. Um, as I recently calculated, I've spent about over 85% of my career working as a language teacher, but more recently I've moved into academia, so to speak. And now I work at the University of Warwick, where I do a lot of not just teaching myself, I do still continue teaching, but I do a lot of teacher education work. I write materials, books, and I do lots of research on teacher research, but also on a range of topics. As a teacher myself, I'm interested in anything to do with the teaching that I love, which is language teaching. And therefore, I kind of do research on things like teacher reflection, teacher expertise, multilingualism in the classroom, and also teaching methodology. I like it to be practical research that has utility for teachers. And I write a few books as well on kind of aspects of methodology or teacher education and
Hmm.
so on.
Very good, thank you. It's a great background. As always, I always think that you're very prolific, productive author and also, researcher with a down-to-earth understanding of the profession, not as a title-based kind of positions, but as a, being a teacher in the essence.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I would like you to actually describe to us what is teacher research. I mean, what is your definition that you've been kind of writing about and talking about in recently, and how would you also describe teacher research literacy in
Mm,
relation to that?
cool, thank you. Let's talk about those separately. So, with regard to the question of what is teacher research, very recently I've been arguing in a couple of talks that it isn't for those of us who I'm now working in academia, for others to define what teacher research is for teachers. It's important that teachers define it for themselves, and that can be on an individual level or with colleagues. The key point being here that academics' understandings of what constitutes research is only one of many ways of understanding what research is or could be. And if you think about the way we use the word research on a day-to-day basis, um, it it varies a lot. And think about, for example, how a police detective might use the word research, a journalist, and all of these are different understandings to academics. So my first point, I suppose, would be teachers should have the agency and the freedom and the right um, to be empowered to define it for themselves. And some of my workshop work has facilitated this. If I were to offer a definition, I suppose I should offer the one that has just recently been published with my colleague at Warwick, Richard Smith. We wrote an article on teacher research in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other language. And in the article, we describe it, we define it as inquiry carried out wholly or primarily by teachers into issues of importance to them in their own work.
Mm.
And importantly, we avoid the word systematic here because inquiry can be systematic, but much teacher research, to my mind, in my opinion, isn't necessarily systematic in a way that an academic would accept.
Yeah.
There is a systematicity to it of sorts, and it can be more instinctual, if that makes sense, in the way that a teacher will often do something not just once, but try it out in a range of ways in a range of classes over a period of time and learn from it in
Mm.
that way. And there is an iteration to a lot of what teachers do when they're trying out stuff in the
Mm.
classroom that I think does have its own systematicity and also importantly is a type of research, albeit something more informal. And when I say informal, I don't mean that in a negative way. Informal research, I think, is the research that most teachers live by. And that, to my mind, means it should be recognized as central to what teacher research is.
Yeah. Very, very.
Just those. just as, sorry to say, just as I think that informal formative assessment is the most important and powerful form of assessment, much more than formal formative assessment or summative assessment, because it's that informal assessment that on a daily basis tells us as teachers whether students are learning or not.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Some years ago, we wrote a chapter for a journal, a special issue, I guess it was. So action research as a way to evaluate our own teaching. And I was
Mm,
trying to say that, rather than being evaluated by, profession development offices or externals, if you do action research, you not only access to students' data, but also like kind of living knowledge in the classroom, but also
no,
self-assess, self-evaluate
yeah,
what you are doing. So you don't need anyone else because research will maybe reveal weaknesses and practices that needs to be changed or
yeah,
amended or improved. So this is a natural, typical, informal assessment, I would say.
yeah,
So research opens
absolutely.
and gives that opportunity as I see it.
Yeah. And importantly, as well as that, I'm sure it also confirms what they're doing right.
Exactly.
Because the most important reason for any teacher professional development and support is to confirm what the teacher is doing right.
Yeah.
Because the most important thing that they should do after any interaction with somebody who's providing support or mentoring is to notice what is working in their teaching and to keep doing it. And
Mhm.
that also enables them to pinpoint areas for development. So yeah, it's a nice idea. And I think that self-evaluation, we often talk about formative assessment, focusing on assessment for learning for the learners, but we can also talk about formative assessment for the teacher. And different types of teacher research are central to that. And our formative assessment acts. If we assess the learners and we find out they haven't learned anything today, then that tells us something about our teaching. And
Mhm.
any good teacher will then think carefully about why that might be and
Okay.
what they will do in the future. And again, that's part of their inquiry process.
Yeah, very nice. So how would you then reflect, actually, not describe, maybe reflect on teacher research literacy in line with how you described it?
Yeah. I think the definition that you recently presented in your talk, which I think is the definition provided in the working group and the research group that you're in, um, I think that to me was a good definition in the sense that it recognized the importance of teachers being able to understand and interpret research and its relevance for their own practice.
Mhm.
Um, there is a lot of research being done of a lot of different types. And often, if you're a non-researcher, whether you're a teacher or somebody else working in another professional field, you often may have rather stereotyped understandings of what research is and also about what it's telling us, what it can tell us, what it can't tell us. And the most important thing to note about research is that whilst it's important and useful, a lot of the time, research is quite limited in what it can tell any individual teacher about what they should do in their classroom. It can't tell them the best way to teach.
Yeah.
It can tell them about what research has indicated is the best way to teach when you look at either one specific context or when you try to generalize across a range of contexts.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that, for example, in even one of those contexts where that generalized research was conducted, the actual truth might be slightly different. So the reality is for teachers to be able to make use of research, they need to understand first and foremost its limitations.
Mhm.
And that can be research conducted both in what we might call kind of positivist, post-positivist paradigms that tends to be quantitative, tends to be larger scale, not always, and tends to be attempting to generalize. And also research conducted within more what we might call interpretivist paradigms, research which is based on a recognition that knowledge systems aren't necessarily generalizable, but are often specific to one context, one way of looking at things, and understanding how that might itself have transferability to their own context or not. So therefore, research can range massively in terms of what it's doing and its potential implications. And for teachers to be able to make use of it, they need to understand some of the things, the limitations of what it's doing, and also these different
Yeah.
approaches and the paradigms underpinning them, which I think are important because they are understandings of the relationship between what we talk about when we talk about our practice as teachers, in other words, theories, and the world in itself, what we are able to actually learn about the world independently of our theories if that's ever possible, um, which is the world essentially in which our connection with our learners happen, in the sense that even though it is a world of language, it's the world where we are hoping learning is happening. And so, whilst there are a range of different paradigms involved here, those questions I think are really important for our being critical of
Mm,
research. And criticality can be both empowering in two ways. First of all, it can help us to reject research evidence if we don't think it's true or relevant to our classrooms. But it's also something which can enable us to say, yeah, okay, no, this research is important, it is useful, and it looks like there's an implication here for me in my practice. And now I feel confident that I can see if it will work in my
mm.
classroom. And then they will try maybe to look at it and to implement it.
Very good. So if you tell our audience, what are the elements, what are the kind of competencies that can be included in the concept of literacy?
That's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I
I
should
mean,
have done a
that's
bit of
just
homework.
general because
Yeah.
we often say that like the literature defines it, and they talk about, being able to read an article, being able
Mm,
to read academic text, and then
mm,
being able to come up with some ideas and then transfer it into classroom and then
mm,
implement it and then see if it works. Or they say being able to do research, but these are very anchoring, like broad
mm.
competencies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So I suppose a key feature here is actually um, teacher research, accessing research of any type, and therefore being aware of the different types of research that are conducted that might be relevant. And this can include what I would call academic research, research conducted usually by people with university affiliations. It could be conducted in collaboration with teachers, but the key point is that research is often typically published. Initially, the primary research in research journals, sometimes books that are inaccessible themselves. And teachers can often gain access to the findings of this research through secondary literature, which is fine, but it's always useful to be able to compare and to contrast with these. So understanding how to gain access to that kind of research is important, but also being aware that research doesn't just stop there and that there is an increasing amount of teacher research being conducted that itself is just as useful, if not more so, for teachers. As you were mentioning your article with Simon Mumford, that indicates that teachers often prefer to write about other teachers' writings, read about other teachers' research in the way that teachers write about it because it connects with them, particularly if that teacher shares a subject or a first language or a context with you, obviously. So that's also another type, and that can be found in different spaces. I work in the field of English language teaching mainly, but not only. And I know of certain journals which publish research for teachers and also certain groups and organizations,
Mm.
such as the IATF or Research Special Interest Group, um, which is a really useful way to learn about different types of research that are published. So to give you that kind of first idea, it's actually being aware of what types are out there and how to access it, both primary and secondary research. The second one I would mention is that critical element. To always never assume that somebody telling you about the findings of research, particularly the implications of practice, will necessarily apply to your classroom. They may do, but they may not do.
Mm.
And that's the key thing to be aware of. And any teacher, even the teacher working in a context where the research was conducted, say the research says it was conducted in primary school classrooms in India, and you're an Indian primary teacher, that doesn't mean it will work for your learners in your classroom. And therefore, being able to read what it says about the context, the people involved, and the aims of the research, and whether it's relevant to you is key. So that criticality is important, I think. And then I suppose a final stage that for me is really, really important is as and when teachers feel that a piece of research is useful for them and they can draw upon it, regardless of where it comes from, to make use of it in a way that enables them to adapt it to their context, and also to reflect on whether that adaptation has worked. There are all kinds of terms for this. You can call it very informally a trial or a tryout. Jeff Petty talks about supported experiments. And there are lots of models of action research and reflective practice that can help with this as well.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we have also mentioned that using research, which also broadly refers to, so how you can, get theoretical or research findings and then see how it can be implemented in the classroom. If a research, for example, suggests that you need to give feedback in a particular way at a particular time, in a particular channel, etc., based on research, and then you go and try that and then see if it works. So you're using research in your classroom. But I also add to the literacy definition or description is how I can theorize my practices. So let me
Yeah.
analyze what I do in my classroom first before I see the research. And then I try to find out evidence that can support what I do or that can contradict. So rather than applying, the research first, we can
Yeah.
also look into our practices, because I think Richard was sharing yesterday a piece written by someone, Richard Smith. So this breaking ivory tower or something like that,
Yeah.
where academics discourse is not, attending to teachers' sensitivities,
Yeah.
expectations, etc., in terms of what you meant, like accessibility to kind of language and the resource itself physically. I think that's why I think we should go into our classrooms, try to investigate and analyze our practices, come up with something, and then see how research is can be kind of compared and contrasted with that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think the direction should be two-way here. How am I theorizing my practices, and how theory can be implemented in my classroom? Maybe there is another way of doing
Mm.
it, but yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's one thing I've argued that we mustn't overlook teachers' theories. One of my concerns with using the phrase practitioner research, well, there's several here. You're implying that teachers, in a way, are practitioners, and therefore you're almost kind of taking away the importance of teachers theorizing
Mhm.
from that definition. You're also kind of, I much prefer the phrase professional rather than practitioner research, because
Mhm.
professional sees teacher research and also teacher research literacy, in our opinions, I'm sure, as being a part of their professional
Yeah.
competence,
Mhm.
their professional knowledge, skills, awareness that enables them to do their job better. And if we centralize it as something that teachers do, not just practitioners, because in a language classroom, in any classroom, there can be lots of practitioners involved, including the learners in some definitions, and that's fine. But teachers themselves, to my mind, should see it as part of their professional skill set to be able to do research and to evaluate it. And when it comes to the question of theory, I mean, the research I've done on teacher expertise, which is quite extensive, one thing you notice when you're interacting with expert teachers is they do have very clear theories of what works for them in their classroom. And
Mhm.
those theories underpin their work. And if an academic comes in and tells them, well, you should be doing this, that teacher is very capable of articulating sophisticated theories to say why certain academic theories may not work in their classroom. And that is important for giving them that robust confidence to be able to continue doing what they do, even though sometimes generalizable or other generated research doesn't necessarily apply in their classroom.
Mhm. Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, we also agreed that we could talk about why is it important for teachers, whether pre-service teachers or in-service teachers,
Mm,
to develop, teacher research literacy.
mm,
Why do they need to do research? Not only do research, but also develop the concept of literacy in their
yeah.
profession.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it's useful at all stages, and I think it's useful for somewhat different reasons at different stages. I think pre-service it gives them the skills to access um, ideas about what is considered appropriate practice, good practice in certain classrooms. And that can give them ideas and inform them. But in a pre-service context, it can be overwhelming because there is so much research and each of it is often focusing on just a little bit of their practice. And in that sense, understanding the basic paradigms of research, the basic types of research done, and also understanding which bits of that are most likely to be useful. Sometimes systematic reviews can be most useful for teachers at that stage, but also interpreted research, research which is interpreted by experts in their field as secondary literature, providing those who are supporting them, the teacher educators, potentially academics, are confident that this secondary literature is useful for those particular teachers, then that can be really useful. But when it comes to more experienced teachers, I think I think it's really important that they can also engage directly with the literature, with the findings, and also start to become part of that. And one of the things that we see in the increasing amount of research output that's being produced by teachers is that teachers quite naturally have different goals and different interests when engaging with research and when disseminating it. Quite rightly and quite understandably, they don't see academic journals as being a priority for them. And yet, those of us who work in academia, it's kind of part of our job description that we have to publish in those journals. Teachers much prefer to write in journals which are accessible, which are practitioner oriented. These may not have the same peer review process, but they don't necessarily need it because while rigor is a key part of any academic research publication, for teacher research, a teacher is often saying, this works for me in my context, or
Yes.
rather, this worked for me in my context, and here's how and why. And therefore, describing that context, describing how and why it worked is far more important. And therefore, the idea that somebody should come in and tell them whether their research findings are consistent with certain processes or the literature isn't necessarily a typical, very useful type of review.
Yeah.
Peer review is a much better peer teacher review is a much better way of doing that. So, for example, if we are to look at journals, there's one called the Learner Development Journal, where instead of starting a piece of writing by talking about what the literature says on a topic, they talk about their context and why they did this research. And that is considered to be a more appropriate way in. And you can even see that in, for example, practitioner journals such as EOT Journal, TESOL Journal, where often teachers are encouraged and often do that much more than prior literature. That is for me a kind of a key area, a way into developing a research literacy that enables them to contribute to that literature. And there's all kinds of other things that we could go on to for example, how teachers disseminate that. But obviously, conferences are a key part of that. Online activities and events are a key part of that. And I think those of us who are interested in supporting teacher research, need to allow teachers to keep developing these systems that they have for sharing their own research and stop assuming, which fewer academics are doing now, but there are still some, that for teacher research to be valid or useful, it has to be published in some kind of formal journal.
Very good. Yeah, I think I like the idea of teachers writings and peer review process because, as you said, academic perspectives may mislead teachers about their practices, about which they don't know much. Actually, the reality, the purpose, and the students, the context, etc. And the teachers are paying more attention to relevance and functionality of things. You know, if it works there, it works, and they like it, and students like it too.
Yeah, yeah.
But
One thing I haven't mentioned, which will be good to mention as well, is the importance of teacher agency.
yeah,
And we often see in education systems here in the UK, it's true to an increasing extent, and it's not a good trend. And it's been true in America as well more recently. Um, in contexts where teachers are being told how to teach in quite prescriptive ways. I'll give you an example. Here in the UK, we have something called phonics, which is a system for developing literacy. And research evidence has indicated that one way of teaching phonics is more effective than another. Synthetic phonics is considered to be the best way to do it. And the evidence is clear that when you generalize across a large number of teachers, there is a difference. But the difference isn't big. And there is still a big argument and question about how phonics should be best implemented in classrooms. A teacher who is literate in research will be able to look at all that research evidence and decide the extent to which they do want to follow the kind of the guidelines or even the prescriptions of the system, or whether, for example, they want to balance between a synthetic approach to phonics and an analytic approach to phonics, which is the potential alternative. And to my mind, most expert teachers who work with phonics have more of a balance, not because they're less effective, but because they recognize that both of them can help learners to develop the literacy that they need. That is the aim of phonics development. Only a teacher who is literate in both the large scale research that is being used to tell them what to do and also their own research practices is able or is well enough informed, if you like, to say, for example, to their school head teacher or a school inspector, I understand that research, I understand what it's saying, but here's the reason why that approach may not work as well in this particular classroom with this group of learners. So there's a sense in which that research literacy gives them agency and it gives them empowerment.
Yeah, exactly. And these two are also going hand in hand. I mean, to be able to be empowered, you need to be given this agency that you need
Yeah.
to exercise when you're making decisions about how you're teaching, what you're teaching. As you said, I mean, I think agency is being taken away from teachers in many ways in different countries, and teacher research or action research projects are bringing them back. We say that here is the space, here is the opportunity, go and do, here is the support, do your research, analyze your classrooms and students, and regain your agency. Don't wait anyone to give you the agency. Here is how you can get your agency back.
Mm,
And we have always discussed that. And Burns is also always saying, it's empowering, but
mm,
it's never unpacked fully. So what
mm,
is empowerment? So empowerment
mm,
can happen in different ways. And I don't think somebody should empower us all the time. This is one way. How about self-empowerment? And
mm,
action research and teacher research is offering this opportunity and even the space in the physical sense or in the imaginary sense that I can reclaim my empowerment or initiate my empowerment process myself without waiting. And research is one way of doing that, or reflective practice, or
yeah,
initiating kind of different forms of research in our classroom. But without agency, you cannot exercise your empowerment either. So they are all like how teachers are developing their own development, how they're learning to develop as an individual teacher. And I think literacy in terms of that aspect includes, being agentic, as you said, and, on top of what you said about empowerment, I would say self-empowerment is more powerful than waiting someone to empower us with something.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely agree.
But
Yeah.
that's a great conversation. Would you like to add something else before
Yeah,
we?
just to say there's teachers at the other end of that spectrum. There's many teachers in the world who, once they complete their pre-service education, particularly in the global south, the global majority, who are often abandoned in the classroom and nobody really cares about what they do. This is another really important reason why teacher research literacy, but also teachers being aware of their practices and doing research is really important because it can give them the independence. As some of the expert teachers I've worked with in India have talked about, they talk about introspection, which kind of links to the what we were talking about theory building. But it was for them, these are teachers in India, a way of actually reflecting on their practice in a way that enables them to decide what is working and what isn't working in my classroom. And even if those teachers can't access formal academic research, by being involved in, for example, online communities, and there are many of these communities for teacher research nowadays, that can then give them the motivation to conduct projects in their own context that enable them to continue developing in the absence of anybody around them who either wants to or has the expertise to help them to become a better teacher. They can do that on their own, particularly if they engage with others' research, other teachers and academic research, and also if they begin to conduct both more informal and more formal research in their own classroom.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think the literacy from our perspective is very pragmatic and self-described, so teachers can actually identify the scope of how they see teacher research literacy in terms of to what extent they should, engage in and with research. So it
Mm,
doesn't have to be full literacy perspective. Some people stop, some people just read articles and then get ideas, you
mm,
know. Some
mm,
others want to conduct, and there is no linear sequence between these
yeah,
components anyway.
yeah,
So some people start by doing, as in your context, Richard is always encouraging people to do that. In some other context, they start by learning how to do research first, and then
mhm,
they do it. Uh,
mm,
and they read first and then they do research, or they do research and then they read. So
yeah,
I think it's also personal choice of
yeah,
how they should engage in research, and this is also an agency that they exercise in their professional development journey anyway.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jason, it was great to discuss with you. You opened up different arguments and ideas, which are very insightful for the listeners, I believe. And hope to meet you again and talk more about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenan. It was really nice to chat.
Thank you.